the most basic level, you need to know that there are 3 separate and distinct Aboriginal groups recognized in the Canadian Constitution. The largest group in terms of sheer numbers are Status First Nations. Status First Nations are governed by the Indian Act and are granted recognition by rules set out in the Act as official Indians who have a claim to live on a piece of land called a reserve. These lands are called reservations in the United States. Same concept, different word. The federal government sets rules all by itself, decides who qualifies. Of Canada's approximately one of European settlers flooding into North America. The treaties traded land for reserves and government benefits. Well, that was the theory anyway. The second largest group of Aboriginal people in Canada are the Métis. These are the descendants of the European explorers and fur traders who first visited North America and the First Nation women they met along the way. Except for the Métis settlements in Alberta, the Métis Nation does not have any government-sanctioned land base. In fact, they were not even recognized as Aboriginal people until 1982, during the repatriation of the Canadian Constitution. It was then they were officially deemed to be one of 3 distinct groups of Aboriginal people. The last census put their numbers at almost 390,000, an increase of almost 90% in 10 years. And this is mainly due to the fact that more Métis are now willing to claim their heritage. Almost 70% of the Métis live in urban areas, mainly in the West and in Ontario. The smallest of the 3 Aboriginal groups in Canada are the Inuit. These are the hardy people who made a living off the land for thousands of years on the barren fringes of the Arctic, a vast, isolated area stretching from northern Siberia across Alaska and Canada and onto Greenland. There are about 50,000 Inuit in Canada. In the last century, their semi-nomadic hunting culture was destroyed when they were forced into settlements for the convenience of southern bureaucrats in Ottawa. Within a little more than 1 generation, almost 80% of them were concentrated in the small communities of the north.
This just in. 500 years ago, great canoes driven by floating clouds began to visit Turtle Island from the eastern seas, carrying strange men and very interesting trade goods. Nothing would ever be the same again.
Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to another edition of Aboriginal Straight Talk. I'm your host, Harry King. We've had great guests over the last few shows, enlightening us, learning all about our native
game show that's so native. Your special celebrity guest from the Haida, Raven, from the Plains Peoples, Old Man Coyote, and from the stories of the Ojibwe people, Rascally Rabbit. And now, here he is, your host, Bob Strongman.
Hey, everybody! And an additional traditional greeting to all you people out there, huh? Hey, how are ya? Hey, how are ya? Hey, how are you? Welcome to everybody's favorite game show. That's so native. Now, before we pay the bills, I would love to introduce you to today's special panel of contestants. Okay, number 1, we have flying in all the way from over there, the Raven. Raven, how are you doing today? Give me some feathers. Wonderful. Now, we have who are the Métis. Number 1, the descendants of the red and white races who met and mixed in North America. 2, a vegetable stew also known as Macedon. Or 3, the name of a minor league hockey team in New Brunswick. I'm sorry, contestants, but that sound means that your time is up.
We've been looking at the big picture so far. Now it's time to add a few more detailed brushstrokes. We talked about how diverse pre-contact North American societies were. And to illustrate, let's take a look at how 4 different Canadian First Nations lived. In the east were the Mi'kmaq.
The Mi'kmaq are part of the Wabanaki, and we were known as the Dawn people all along the eastern coast. Algonquin is really our linguistic group. We cover New Brunswick, Nova Scotia, and Prince Edward Island. There's 30 different communities that we live on. There is also Mi'kmaq in the Gaspé, and now there is one in Newfoundland. And down in Maine also, there's the Aroostook Band of Indians, which are Mi'kmaq. We lived off the land, of course, as hunters and gatherers. In the summer, we would be along the beaches and we would fish lobster and clams and all the shellfish, and of course the sea bass. And then in the wintertime, we would move inland. And our winter camps there, we would move into the yards for the moose and the deer. And our dwelling places were wigwams made of spruce bark and birch bark. And of course we had huts in the ground also that were 2 feet in the ground and covered like a dome. Sometimes we'd cover them with hides for the winter. And also we had longhouses. Now each family group had a chief or a captain that regulated or governed that group. And to be a chief, you had to be a great hunter, a great athlete, a great provider. We had, of course, a grand chief. And we had a record keeper was called Budus. He kept the records and whatnot. And also we had wampum belts. So these were a way of recording events, treaty of peace and friendship between different tribes and so on. That when we had a Grand Council meeting, everybody had a voice. Today is known as the talking circle. If you didn't really agree with something, you would voice your opinion then, but the thing that would happen is they would respect your decision, and eventually they'd reach a consensus.
Actually, it belongs to a group called the Algonquian language. And of course, within the Cree itself, there's 5 different major dialects to it. We have the Plains Cree, the Wood Cree, the Swampy Cree, Lakeland Cree. We also have other Cree out on the East Coast. The Mi'kmaq are Algonquian speakers, and the Ojibwa are Algonquian speakers as well.
When we say Kayachtin to someone, we say, I hold my hands up to you, you are an honorable person. So our welcome figures would be what we would have in our village sites, so people would know that they are welcome. They're welcome to come ashore.
The nations we just heard about were and are all very different, from the environments that molded them, the way they governed themselves, the foods they ate, and how their economies were structured. The same differences that applied to many Native nations in the past still linger in the present. There are, however, a number of elements that many Aboriginal cultures share, things that hold a special meaning to most Aboriginal communities.
You've got to be careful of those kinds of things, because it only serves to undermine what we're trying to do to bring our culture and traditions back, but at the same time it can set a person back in terms of being really genuine, in terms of looking for help or knowledge. And so you've got to consider your source.
Our medicines, they were there long ago. From the elders, they have that knowledge.
Is a wheel, it spins